My stepmother was still smiling when the attorney slid the envelope across the table. That smile. I had spent 31 years learning every version of it. The soft one she used on my father's colleagues at Christmas parties. The tight one she wore at my college graduation when she realised people were congratulating me and not her. And this one. The wide, settled, victorious smile of a woman who believed she had already won before the game began. She had spent the last 4 minutes telling a room full of my father's relatives that he died hating me. The envelope proved otherwise. My name is Daniel Hargrove. I am 31 years old. I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, in a neighbourhood where the houses are old and the money is older, and nobody ever raises their voice because cruelty sounds so much more permanent when it's delivered quietly. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, I need to take you back 18 months to the afternoon my father called me from a rest stop on Seaton 64 and told me he needed to tell me something he should have said a long time ago. He never got to finish that sentence. He died 4 days later. Massive coronary, the doctors said. He was 63. The call had come at 3:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in September. I was in my office in Richmond, 40 minutes away. I drove to the hospital. By the time I arrived, my stepmother, Linda Hargrove, was already standing in the hallway outside the ICU with her hand pressed to her collarbone and her eyes perfectly dry. She looked at me walking down that corridor and something moved across her face. It was not grief. It was calculation. She had been calculating around me for 22 years. My father married Linda Beaumont in the spring of 2002. I was 9 years old. My mother had died the previous winter. A car accident on Route 29 during an ice storm, and my father had met Linda at a grief support group at St. Paul's Memorial Church on University Avenue. He was devastated. He was lonely. He was a good man who had spent 6 months trying to figure out how to raise a 9-year-old boy without the woman he had built his entire life around. Linda arrived at exactly the right moment with exactly the right face and exactly the wrong intentions. I did not understand that at 9. I understood it slowly. The way you understand a fracture in a wall. First you see a hairline crack, then another. Then one morning you press your hand against the plaster and the whole thing shifts. Linda had a son from her first marriage. His name was Colton. He was 12 when our parents married. Lean and quiet and already expert at reading which way the wind blew in any given room. He did not bother me directly. He did not have to. Linda did the work. Colton just watched and learned. The first thing Linda did was intercept. I was 10 when I noticed my grandmother, my father's mother, Ruth Hargrove, who lived 40 minutes away in Staunton, had stopped calling on Sundays. She had called every Sunday of my life without exception. Then one week she didn't. Then another. When I asked my father why, he looked confused and said she had called just that morning and spoken with Linda, who had told her I was at a soccer tournament and couldn't come to the phone. I had not been at a soccer tournament. I had been sitting 12 feet away in the living room reading a book. That was the first crack. The calls from my grandmother became irregular after that, and when they did come, they were brief and stiff in the way that phone calls get when someone has been told a version of events that doesn't match what they know. I learned later, much later, that Linda had been telling my grandmother I was adjusting poorly to the new family structure and that too much outside contact was making things harder. She framed it as concern. My grandmother, who was a polite woman from a generation that trusted doctors and daughters-in-law, had accepted this explanation for almost 3 years before something my father said in passing made her realise the calls she thought I was ignoring were calls I was never being told about. By then, the habit of distance had already formed. By then I was 12, and the year I turned 12 was the year Linda began working on my father in earnest. She was strategic about it. I will give her that. She never said I hate your son or your son is a problem. She said things like I'm worried about Daniel's anger, and Daniel said something to Colton today that really upset him, and I found this in Daniel's backpack, and I don't know what to do. She said these things in the careful, measured voice of a woman performing reluctant honesty. My father was not a stupid man, but he was a grieving one, and grief makes a particular kind of blindness, the kind where you are so afraid of failing the people you love that you become vulnerable to anyone who speaks the language of concern. She told him I had threatened Colton. I had not. She told him I had stolen money from her purse. I had not. She told him my teachers had called about my behaviour. They had not. She had called them, identified herself as my mother, and had those conversations herself, then reported back to my father in whatever version served her purposes. I know all of this now because of a single manila folder sitting inside a locked metal box in my father's study, a box he had been quietly filling for 9 years without telling anyone it existed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What Linda actually wanted was simple. She wanted my father's money, and she understood that the cleanest path to it ran through me. If I was difficult, if I was troubled, if I was the kind of son who pushed his father away, then whatever my father chose to give her instead of me would look like a reasonable correction rather than a theft. She was not building a lie. She was building a justification. The year I turned 14, my father sat me down at the kitchen table and told me that he and Linda had decided I needed to see a therapist. He used careful language. He said he was worried about me. He said Linda had noticed some patterns. He said he wanted to help. I sat across from him and felt something go cold inside my chest because I understood, not fully, not with words, but somewhere below words, that he was looking at me through her eyes. I went to the therapist. Her name was Dr. Paula Renner. She had an office on Water Street and a framed print of Monet's water lilies behind her desk. I sat in her office every Thursday for 8 months and talked about my mother and my father and the specific grief of being 9 years old when the most important person in your world stops existing. Dr. Renner was a good therapist. She never told me what Linda had said to get me there. But 20 years later, she would tell me something else. At 16, I stopped arguing. I stopped trying to explain myself to my father because every explanation I gave him had already been pre-rebutted by Linda with a version that cast me as defensive and manipulative. I learned instead to be invisible. I was polite at dinner. I kept my grades up. I applied to the University of Virginia because it was 40 minutes away, and I needed to leave that house without going so far that my father would interpret the distance as abandonment. He drove me to campus in August. We carried boxes up 3 flights of stairs in humid 90-degree heat. When we were done, he stood in the doorway of my dorm room and looked at me for a long moment. He started to say something. Then his phone rang. It was Linda. He answered it. He left without saying whatever he had started to say. I spent the next 12 years doing what people do when they have learned that love from the people who should give it freely will always cost them something. I built a life that did not depend on anyone I could not verify. I got a graduate degree in urban planning. I got a job I was good at. I rented an apartment in Richmond with high ceilings and a kitchen window that looked out over the James River. I called my father on his birthday and on Father's Day, and sometimes in between, and the calls were always warm and a little careful, and never quite long enough for either of us to say the real thing. Linda was always there, in the background, asking who he was talking to, offering to say hello, making her presence felt as a gentle but absolute fact. The one exception was my grandmother. Ruth Hargrove was 81 years old and had outlasted 2 hip replacements, 1 husband, and what she described as Linda's 20-year audition for a role she never deserved. My grandmother had figured Linda out around year 3 of the marriage and had spent the subsequent 19 years in a condition of polite armed neutrality that fooled no one and offended everyone. She called me every Sunday. She had never stopped. She had simply started calling my cell phone instead of the house. It was my grandmother who called me the morning after my father died. She did not cry. She was not that kind of woman. She said, "Daniel, I need you to know something before Linda starts talking. Your father called me 2 weeks ago. He said he needed to fix something. He said he had been doing something in secret for a long time, and he was almost finished. He said he was going to tell you. Whatever Linda says in the next few days, I need you to remember that sentence." He was almost finished. I sat with that for 18 months. The will reading was on a Thursday in March. The office of Pemberton and Avery, attorneys at law, on East Jefferson Street in downtown Charlottesville. A conference room on the 2nd floor, with tall windows and the kind of carpet that absorbs sound. My father's attorney was a man named Warren Pemberton, 68 years old, silver-haired, with the slow, deliberate manner of someone who has learned that patience is the most effective weapon in any room. Linda arrived first. She brought Colton. She had chosen a chair at the centre of the table, which meant she would be visible to everyone without having to turn. She had dressed carefully. dark blue, simple jewellery, the presentation of a woman in tasteful grief. Colton sat beside her in a blazer that was slightly too new. My Aunt Carol, my father's sister, sat across from them. My Uncle Barry next to her. My cousin Marcus at the end. My grandmother walked in at exactly 10 o'clock and chose a seat directly across from Linda, without acknowledging her and without looking away from her once she sat down. I sat beside my grandmother. Warren Pemberton entered at 10:02 and set 2 folders on the table. One was thick, one was thin, sealed, and sat slightly apart from the other. He opened the thick folder first and began reading in a level voice. The procedural portions took 12 minutes. Then he reached the distribution section. Linda's hands settled on the table like she was claiming territory. The will my father had signed in 2014 left the primary residence to Linda as surviving spouse, along with the investment accounts he had held jointly in both their names, a vehicle, and the furniture. It left me a sum of $40,000 and a storage unit in Waynesboro whose contents were not inventoried. It left Colton nothing, which caused a small visible flinch at Linda's end of the table. Linda turned to me before Warren Pemberton had fully finished reading. Her voice was soft, almost kind. "Daniel, sweetheart, I want you to hear this from me. Your father told me, in his last weeks, that the 2 of you had never truly repaired things. He felt that the $40,000 was generous, given the distance you'd kept. He said, and I'm telling you this because you deserve honesty. He said you were the one relationship in his life he had genuinely given up on." Silence. My Aunt Carol looked at her coffee cup. My Uncle Barry looked at the carpet. My grandmother looked at Linda with the steady, unimpressed attention of a woman who has been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment. Warren Pemberton reached into the second folder. He removed a sealed manila envelope. He read something on the inner surface of the flap. He slid it across the table to me without a word. He did not read it aloud. He did not explain it. He simply moved it from his side of the table to mine with the careful deliberateness of a man executing an instruction he had been given a long time ago. Linda's eyes went to the envelope. Her smile stayed, but something behind it went very still. My Uncle Barry, who had not spoken directly to me in 4 years, and who I had always suspected knew more than he said, leaned across the table and put his hand briefly on my forearm. He said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "Your father was not a man who did things without a reason. Remember that before you open that." I picked up the envelope. I stood. I walked out. I sat in my car in the parking garage on Water Street for 23 minutes. The envelope was on the passenger seat. I looked at it the way you look at something you have needed for a long time and are suddenly afraid to have. Then I opened it. Inside was a letter, 6 pages. My father's handwriting. The careful, architectural print of a man who had drafted technical documents for 30 years. Beneath the letter was a smaller sealed envelope marked, "Do not open without Pemberton present." Beneath that was a key on a plain steel ring with a strip of orange electrical tape marking the bow and a sticky note in my father's hand that read, "Waynesboro. Unit 14, the thing she never found." I read the letter. The first paragraph was not addressed to me. It was addressed to Warren Pemberton. It read, "Warren, please do not read this envelope's contents aloud in any room where Linda is present. Slide it to Daniel. He will know what to do with the time." The letter to me began on the second page. "Daniel, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have just sat through something I am genuinely sorry you had to sit through. I know what Linda said. I have known for years what she would say, because I have listened to her say smaller versions of it for 22 years, and I was not always brave enough to stop her. That is the part of this I need you to understand first. I'm not asking you to excuse it. I'm asking you to understand that what follows took me as long as it did because I was building something that could not be undone once it was started. I needed it to be right. I needed it to be complete. I needed her to have no door left." He wrote for 6 pages. He told me about the morning in the spring of 2013 when he found, in Linda's desk drawer while looking for a stamp, a notebook. He described it precisely. Brown cover, college ruled, roughly 60 pages used. He had read 4 pages before he understood what it was. It was a record, dates, conversations, strategies, a log of every lie she had told him about me, cross-referenced with his reactions, annotated with notes about what had worked and what hadn't. He had photographed every page with his phone. He had put the notebook back exactly as he found it. He had not confronted her. He had called Warren Pemberton the following Monday. What came after that was 9 years of patient, invisible architecture. The 40,000 in the will was deliberate. It was the number Linda had suggested to him in 2017 when she thought she was shaping his decisions. He had let her believe she had won that argument. The real structure was elsewhere. An irrevocable trust established in 2014, funded over the following 8 years, in amounts small enough to avoid the conversations that larger transfers would have triggered. The trust held $412,000. It was not part of the estate. It was not subject to the will. It was not Linda's. The storage unit held the rest. Not money. Evidence. The notebook photographed and printed. Letters Linda had intercepted. Physical letters, 12 of them, that my father had mailed to me during my teenage years. From work trips and which had been returned to him by me, he had believed, with no response. He discovered in 2013 that I had never received them. They had never been sent. Linda had collected them from the outgoing mail, steamed them open, and replaced them with a single short note in handwriting that approximated mine, which said something brief and cold and designed to read like a teenager's dismissal. I had been answering letters I had never received with silence I had never chosen. He wrote in the letter, "I spent 2 years believing you did not want to hear from me. Then I found the notebook and I understood that your silence had been her answer, not yours." The third thing in the storage unit was a small digital recorder. My father had kept it in his breast pocket for the last 18 months of his life. He had, during that time, allowed Linda to say certain things in his presence that she had previously only said when she believed she was unobserved. He had needed patience. He had needed her to become comfortable. He had needed her to believe she was already winning. She had been very comfortable. The recordings were transcribed in a bound document, 71 pages. Warren Pemberton had a copy. I was holding the index. The last page of my father's letter was short. "I tried every way I knew to reach you directly. I did not always know what was being said in my name or what was being done with the things I sent. I know now. I should have been braver earlier. I should have said this to you in person. I intended to. I ran out of road before I got there. The trust is yours, the unit is yours, the recordings are yours. What you do with them belongs to you. I will only say this. I never gave up. The distance between us was not mine. I built a door back the whole time. I just ran out of time to walk through it with you. Dad." I sat in that car for a long time. Then I called my grandmother. The second meeting was 3 weeks later. Same room, same carpet. Warren Pemberton had notified all parties that additional documentation required a formal session. Linda arrived with a lawyer, a man named Gerald Fitch from a firm in Richmond who specialised in estate disputes and who had a confident, slightly aggressive manner that told me he had not yet been briefed on what was actually in the room. I arrived with Warren Pemberton, my grandmother, and a woman named Dr. Sylvia Cross, who was a forensic documents examiner with the University of Virginia School of Law, and who had spent the previous 2 weeks reviewing every piece of paper in Storage Unit 14. Linda saw Dr. Cross and did not recognise her. She smiled at her pleasantly. Warren Pemberton opened without preamble. He laid the trust certification on the table first. He read the date, the corpus amount, the beneficiary, my full legal name, Daniel Edward Hargrove, and the co-trustees, which were himself and my grandmother. Gerald Fitch leaned forward. He asked a question about the trust's relationship to the probate estate. Warren answered him in a single sentence. The trust is irrevocable and was established prior to any subsequent marital decisions. It is not subject to these proceedings or to Mrs. Hargrove's claims. Linda's hand pressed flat against the table. She said, "Edmund would have told me about something like this. He told me everything about our finances." Warren did not look at her. He said, "The trust was funded in increments specifically structured to remain beneath the threshold of required spousal disclosure under Virginia law. Your husband was a careful man." Then he introduced Dr. Cross. Dr. Cross laid 12 documents on the table. 12 letters, each in my father's handwriting, each addressed to me at addresses I had lived at between the ages of 14 and 22. She placed beside each letter a corresponding short response, the notes Linda had substituted. She explained in clear, technical language the process by which forensic analysis identifies paper stock, ink composition, and handwriting characteristics. She explained what the analysis had concluded. She said, "The response letters attributed to Daniel Hargrove were composed on paper stock not commercially available until 2 to 3 years after their dated composition. They were written in a hand consistent with Mrs. Linda Hargrove's known writing samples in 4 specific letter formations. They are not Daniel Hargrove's letters." Colton pushed back his chair. He did not stand. He just pushed it back, as if creating distance from the table was the only thing he could manage. Linda said, "That is absolutely—" Gerald Fitch put his hand on her arm. She stopped. Warren Pemberton moved to the notebook. He laid the photographic prints in a stack in the centre of the table. He did not read from them. He simply said, "This document was discovered in the marital residence in April of 2013. It was photographed without Mrs. Hargrove's knowledge. It details, in Mrs. Hargrove's handwriting, a structured campaign of communication, interdiction, and narrative management conducted against Daniel Hargrove beginning in approximately 2004. It contains 73 dated entries spanning 9 years. Copies have been provided to Gerald Fitch this morning. He may wish a few minutes to review." Gerald Fitch was already reading. Linda was looking at the photograph of the notebook cover with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was not the expression of a woman caught in a lie. It was the expression of a woman who had spent 22 years certain that a particular thing was safely destroyed and was now understanding for the first time that it had never been destroyed at all. She had never found the notebook after 2013. She had looked. My father had moved it. Then Warren Pemberton said, "There are also recordings." He did not play them in the room. He had decided, and I had agreed, that playing them in that room was unnecessary. It was enough to state that they existed. It was enough to say what they contained. It was enough to watch Gerald Fitch set down the notebook photographs and stare at the wall with the expression of a man who has just understood that his client had not been entirely honest with him about the facts of the situation. Linda turned to me. Her voice was the soft one, the Christmas party voice. She said, "Daniel, sweetheart, whatever you think you know." I said, "I don't think anything." I reached into the folder in front of me and I put a single piece of paper on the table. It was a settlement agreement. Warren had drafted it the week before. I slid it across the polished wood to Gerald Fitch. I said, "You can read that now or you can read it tomorrow. Either way, the answer is the same." She relinquished the house within 48 hours of Gerald Fitch explaining to her, in terms apparently very clear, that the recordings alone were enough to expose her to civil liability that dwarfed anything she had gained from the estate. She disclaimed any interest in the trust. She returned, as part of the settlement terms, $12,000, representing the aggregate value of assets redirected during my minority. She signed a notarized statement acknowledging that certain representations made at the initial will reading were not factually supported. Warren Pemberton put that statement in the public record. She did not contest it. The week after the settlement, my grandmother called me on a Sunday. At the time, she had always called. She said, "Your father used to call me every Sunday at noon. He asked me the same question every week for 12 years. He said, 'Mum, is Daniel all right?' I told him I thought you were. I should have told him to call you himself. I should have told him more things." She paused. Then she said, "The house needs someone in it. I am 81, and I am not going to live there. You grew up in it. It would be right if you wanted it." I drove to Charlottesville the following Saturday. The house was quieter than I remembered. The room smelled like old wood and the particular kind of stillness that gathers in places where people used to be. I walked through the kitchen, the hallway, the study where my father had spent 20 years sitting at a desk that still held the shape of him in the worn leather of the chair. On the desk was a small framed photograph I had never seen. My mother and my father on their wedding day, 23 years earlier. My father was looking at her instead of the camera. His expression was the unguarded one, the one I remembered from before my mother died, the one that had gone carefully controlled after that and never quite come back. I set the photograph on the mantel in the living room. I sat down in my father's chair. I stayed there for a long time. I thought about the 9-year-old boy who had written his father a letter he never received, and the man who had spent 9 years quietly building the letter back. I thought about 22 years of distance that had not been indifference but had looked exactly like it from the wrong angle. I thought about the Tuesday afternoon phone call that had ended before the real sentence could be spoken, and what that sentence might have been. I thought I already knew. Colton sent me a text 2 weeks after the settlement. It was short. It said, "I didn't know about the letters. I knew she said things. I let her because it was easier. I'm not asking you to forgive that. I just wanted you to know that part. He didn't sign it with his name. He didn't need to. I have not responded yet. I am not sure what I want to say. I am not sure the right version of that conversation exists yet. But I have not deleted the number. My grandmother established a scholarship in my mother's name at the University of Virginia's School of Architecture, where my father had studied 40 years ago. The first recipient was selected in April. She asked me to sit on the selection committee. She said, "Your father would have wanted it to be you who decided. I am just providing the funds." I said yes. The dogwoods were blooming the morning I finally opened the storage unit completely. Not to retrieve the evidence, but to see what else my father had left. The unit was small, climate-controlled, smelling faintly of cardboard and motor oil. The evidence boxes were stacked on the left. On the right, against the wall, was a single shelving unit. On it, 12 letters in a rubber-banded stack. The real ones, the ones he had written, and never sent because he didn't trust the mail anymore, addressed to me at every address I had lived at, from 14 to 26. A small carved wooden compass he had promised to give me when I was 8, and that I had forgotten I ever wanted. And at the front of the shelf, on top of everything else, a sealed envelope with my name on it in his handwriting. And beneath the name, in smaller print, the words, "For when you're ready." Not before. I stood in that unit for a long time. Then I picked up the envelope and I put it in my jacket pocket. I turned off the light. I pulled down the door. I was not ready yet. But I was getting there. He had known I would. He had waited the whole time.